seems I was expected for another old man reads Creepypastas. As this is a highly innovative show, when I'm reading from the Creepypasta from now on, I'll usually be holding up my storybook like this, so you can more easily tell when the stupidity's coming from the story or from me.
Oh, thank you for making me a part of this.
Shut up, you completely useless book. If I want to talk to an inanimate object, I'll talk to a candle, thanks. Though, it is really hard for me to resist eating them. After last time's completely silly Sonic the Hedgehog story, I am proud to tell you that today's story is really gonna up the fear factor because it's about Spongebob Squarepants. Ew. What? Well, at least it's about a suicide. That's pretty scary. Though it's the suicide of a cartoon, and who the hell really cares what happens to a cartoon, am I right? Squidward's suicide. I just want to start off by saying, if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. Really? We're starting this off with a prepare to be disappointed because this wasn't thought through and is going to suck? Wow. At least they were honest, I suppose. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005. Back when anything could happen at Nickelodeon. For my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't. We're getting a valuable lesson here. But it did have some perks beyond education. Getting to see the cartoons kill themselves. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. I sure hope my kids aren't as big into suicide as this freak is. Though, I probably didn't help things by naming only one of them Beauty. I'm a bad parent. Now, since I work directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. I doubt it, as I still see a lot of words in this story. They had very recently made the Spongebob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat snapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. More upsetting than a movie happening. It's a pretty big bummer. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. Sounds like the necessary team to be together for that. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't yet final, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye by Valve. When SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. No unnecessary details in this story. Nothing particularly funny, you get that right, but work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card, Squidward Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. Especially the animators who were present, like you said, who would have had to be the ones to put it in. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it. I made sure to write this in my notebook as I knew it'd be very very important for a stupid story later. The happy-go-lucky music plays as is normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. I was amazed. This was the most boring episode of Spongebob Squarepants I'd ever seen, so I made sure to commit everything I saw to memory. The Bubbles splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, sound is synced up with animation, so yes, that's not common. Well, I guess it's completely useless now. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There is a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. When does booing not have malice in it? I don't think I've heard this happy cartoon booing before. That's when I realized I said a creepypasta because the extra qualifying statements made no sense whatsoever. Squidward's in full frame and looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in center frame and he too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing though. What is odd is that this lasted for exactly 17 seconds. No, just kidding. What is odd is everyone had hyper-realistic eyes. Oh, for the love of useless. So, yay, it wasn't him telling us the seconds, it was the other stupid creepypasta thing. Very detailed! Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. Oh, yeah, that thing between live action and CGI that doesn't exist. Gotcha! The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but we weren't the writers. We didn't question its appeal to children yet. Yeah, because that would happen before you get to Final Cut, moron! But I'm not a writer, so I didn't question this story's nonsense. Oh wait, yes I did. Did none of the animators who you said were in this room have anything to say about this yet? Just everyone in this crack team over at Nickelodeon you had gathered around this monitor just said, let's see where this is going before we question anything? The shot goes to Squidward, sitting on the edge of his bed looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is at this point there is no sound. Literally no sound, not figuratively no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. We have really shoddy equipment over at Nickelodeon. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds. There it is. He went there. Then he started to sob softly. I know the feeling, 30 seconds boy. He put his hands, tentacles, over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. The crack team at Nickelodeon said, well, it still might be good. Let's see where it's going. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. Luckily, I, with my bionic ears, detected this slight increase in volume of the barely audible noise. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face. By slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart side by side. I guess what I'm trying to say is it was incredibly boring. So, no one there was questioning the appeal to kids yet? Still might be airable, guys? Okay. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists in on itself for a split second, then turns back to normal. My eyes were glued to this barely zooming in screen to notice it, I suppose. The wind through the trees sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is this sound, though the eerie part earlier was the no sound. Guess this cartoon can't win either way. And Squidward's sobbing sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming through from the other side. Yeah, that's how sound sounds like coming from a speaker. As good as sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. My super ears could detect that the bitrate was better than sound in real life. Below the sound of wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. Hope it's not Sonic. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had time to think about them. Oh, he watched this thing twice to make sure. That covers everything. Like this, after 30 seconds counting of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animator paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face popped. Upturned face popped? He was naked down to his underwear, his stomach crudely cut open and his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. And still, we had to watch this twice to see if it had appeal for children. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. Really? That was what upset you the most? Not the entrails or the dangling eye? It was the shadow? There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem that the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death, because crime scene photographers never take pictures at more than one angle or anything. We were, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it's just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing louder than before and half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. Well, let's hope it's not hyper-realistic. The blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style. looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sound of branches. So there's the possibility one of your animators is a child murderer, but what really impresses you is the snapping sounds of branches. Why was no one calling the police yet? The laughing, a deep baritone, super ears lasted at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen flashed again, twisted, and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew he had to. Or you could do the sensible thing and restrain the crazy person responsible for inserting dead children photos into your cartoon who's possibly in the same room with you and turn it over to the police. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach. Her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out and popped. Too popped out and popped? Naked! Except for underpants, meaning not naked. Her entrails were piled on top of her, above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible. Very similar in size and shape to the first. What, did the photographer bring the same light source and set it the same distance apart from him so he'd cast the same shadow? I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. Women, am I right? 2 child murders, and suddenly they don't think this is a good cartoon anymore. Unlike the rest of us morons, the show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was when the scene started. The silence was so real sounding that it actually sounded like it was coming from the speakers. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in the hyper-realism like the others were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all is his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep voice laughing, and this time the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. If it had lasted for 6 frames, this cartoon would no longer be suitable for children. We had to put our foot down. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th. Suddenly the animator instead of the editor's controlling this. But he had stopped it on the 4th, the best of the 5 frames, and backed up. This time, the photo was of a boy about the same age, but this time, the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe. But the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. So why did we know it was different? He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first and played them together, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor. Hyper-realistic vomit, like it was almost really there, and then I touched it and I found out it was. I'm an idiot. The animating and sound editors gasping at the screen, apparently not noticing the guy vomiting in the middle of the room. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos, they were played out as if they were frames from a video. So this gruesome child murder scene only induced vomiting once you realized they were sequential. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. I think you have a poor understanding of how long 5 frames actually last, buddy. The lead animator told us to stop. Turns out that the 3rd child death in a cartoon is in fact strike 3. He had to call in the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there. So the editor just continued the episode. We wanted this to be a surprise. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer. Full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out and that deep voice said, "Do it." I don't know whose deep voice, it's just that deep voice. You know, that one. And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. I got a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters on the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with the force. Squidward had become a Jedi. The last 5 seconds of this episode show his body on the bed, on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends! Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the heck was going on. Ooh, he was so mad he was saying heck. Most people left the room at this point, so it's just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and cause me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. Especially because I was still standing there in my pile of vomit. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. This was a little bit more than a minor edit. One of the animators on this episode had to make this. You're really saying it was impossible to find out who? The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. Dun dun dun! All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches. Oh, yeah, it was probably just a virus or a glitch. Someone probably read Sonic.exe on one of the machines. As if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. We were all immediately fired for our gross incompetence. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. The police were just more interested in getting copies of the episode to show their children. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have something happen and can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things. Wow, it sure seems like a valuable lesson was learned at least. Well, I think I see where this story went wrong. The first sentence. It wasn't enough that this magical, creepy episode of SpongeBob just somehow came down the line to you guys, but it also had to include dead children photos. Kinda went a little overboard there. And I'm glad the investigation into it was met with a shrug. I'm gonna go watch Suicide Mouse to cheer myself up.